Well, Obrafo is a man of a musical generation who may not have necessarily experienced Kwame Nkrumah physically, but of course the inspiration from his leadership is one that also unconsciously inspired him to put together this all-time favorite piece honoring Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, a name that resonates in different parts of the world. But the big question we're asking ourselves on a day when we're commemorating his legacy and looking at his life and his contribution to our foundations as a nation is, are we doing enough to ensure that what he brought out in terms of his leadership and his ideas are replicated to the generations after? I know you've been looking forward to this conversation, and I'm glad to be in the company of one of Ghana's most celebrated journalists of the last, 4 to 5 decades, who has seen every single leg of practice as a journalist. He's written, he's advocated, he's been punished for it, and he's also now is contributing very heavily to various platforms when it comes to thought leadership and also the continuous discourse about our leadership, our lives as a nation, and also is contributing from the end of media, where he's a media owner. He's the founder of the Pan-African Television Network. He's won the GJA Journalist of the Year not once. He has, like I said, been part of many platforms and many advocacy networks that have put question to authority about the way leadership is going. And of course, it's always a pleasant voice to listen to, especially when you want to delve into the history of our nation from the perspective of Pan-Africanism. And one person who upholded that and lifted that torch greatly was Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. I'm in the good company of the legendary Kwesi Pratt Jnr., a celebrated journalist by all standards, an author, and one who believes very much in the quality of Africa and how Africa should take its rightful place in the bigger picture of the world's geopolitics. Now, this is the latest from his mind and from his intellect. Well, this book was launched last week by His Excellency, the President of the Republic, John Dramani Mahama, and it's titled Reparations. Now, this book is one which is a must-read for everybody from students through to, policy, advocacy groups, through to media, through to people in leadership and all of it, because it has a certain big background of, our leadership, where we have come from, and most importantly, what the world that has exploited us owes us in terms of reparations. I'd just like to start everything off with going through the preface of this very big book. It says, this book is born out of a long-standing wound, one etched deep into the soil, psyche, and soul of Africa. It's a wound that bleeds across centuries of slavery, colonial violence, and economic theft. But it's also a call to action and a demand for repair, justice, and transformation. As an African committed to decolonization, Pan-African unity, and socialist liberation, I have long felt the absence of a comprehensive framework that ties together historical crimes committed against Africa with the concrete proposals for restitution. Now, this book aims at filling a void. It is not a work of abstraction. It is a fierce, unapologetic, and urgent call for reparations. This work is written not for academics or politicians, but for activists, for students, community leaders, and Pan-African youth. It draws upon the insights of Pan-African revolutionaries, Marxist theorists, and anti-colonial fighters, and contemporary grassroots movements. It seeks to expose the systemic roots of underdevelopment and articulate a bold vision for reparative justice and what it could mean in practice. I offer this work as a contribution to the ongoing struggle, and the struggle that demands not only memory, but mobilization. Kwesi Pratt Jr. Thank you so much, legend, for your time. It's great to share your company. Yeah. Let me ask this before we go ahead. You always like to strap this bag. Is it part of the look? Everybody in public space has a certain look and a certain branding.
Well, for me, it's not branding, it's not a look. It's just a matter of convenience,
Very well.
I carry so many things, and I need something to put what I carry in. That's all.
We don't want to go into the details of what you carry. But good to have you. We were just watching a piece that we put together by one of our journalists here, Inathalia Kwanzaa. He's one of our key correspondents from the western part of this country where Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah comes from. There's a holiday. Some monuments have been named after him. Once in a while would have seminars and all of that, focusing on his legacy and leadership. And then, really, that's it. Some of his children are here. The first one passed on, may God bless his soul. And that really is it. And so now you're looking at the new generation, the people we call the Gen Alphas and Gen Zs. And we're looking at how much of Nkrumah we have incorporated in our everyday lives and how they should appreciate it. One of them put it very simply, and I'm sure today we'll be saying it several times. We haven't celebrated Nkrumah enough. The few things I've mentioned, are they enough?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's important to understand that Nkrumah is an extraordinary historical figure. I mean, the world has not been able to produce two Nkrumahs. There's only one. And his influence is so huge, you understand? Perhaps we'll never get an Nkrumah again. Nkrumah is just a phenomenon. One, his background, born in a small village of Nkrumah, to a mother who was illiterate and who was a fishmonger, and a father who was a goldsmith, and rose from this very beginning to become one of the tallest figures in history, comparable to Chairman Mao, comparable to Toussaint Louverture, and so on. You know, I mean, that's significant. There's no comparison. You cannot compare Nkrumah to anybody. He rises above all. I mean, he falls into the category of Marx and Engels, and to some extent can easily be compared to Lenin and so on. So you have this huge icon, you know, minted in Ghana. You cannot replicate him. There may never be another Nkrumah and so on. And this is something that we should learn from, we should work on with a view to improving the conditions of the Ghanaian people and the African people, and generally in building a better world, you know, for all of us.
We get into the story of Nkrumah, and you're looking at the period that he had the opportunity to actually lead after going to, you know, pursue his education in the United Kingdom and all. He returned to Ghana, you know, there during the 50s, had the opportunity to bring a couple of people together. They formed the UGCC. And very quickly, ideas started shifting in opposite directions, and he had to pull himself out and set up the CPP. What could have caused that shift?
Well, I like to look at Nkrumah from the very beginning. I mean, even in his childhood, I mean, Nkrumah was one who wanted to liberate, to give joy, you know, to take us into paradise and so on. He started off by wanting to become a Catholic priest. Okay, so his ideas then were to save us from sin and so on, and eventually take all of us to heaven, to sit on the right-hand side of God, and to drink milk and honey forever.
Yeah.
So that was his idea.
Yeah.
Now, that idea itself was liberating. You know, it was edifying and so on. And then he grew up and was influenced by Kwesi Agri, you know, who was the head of the Chimoto school. And the thing that inspired him from the life of Kwesi Agri was his anti-racism. I mean, his whole belief that you could not play the keys of the piano when you were playing the piano. to get the best harmony, you needed to play the black and white keys and so on, and all of that inspired him. Then his own experiences in the United States of America, where in spite of his education and so on, he was so massively discriminated against and joined the Pan-African circles and student organizations and so on. And then his attempt to form what became known as the West African Students' Union, whose focus was the total liberation of West Africa from the colonial yoke. And most importantly, his participation in the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, where the blueprint for African liberation, was formulated and publicized and so on. And he was the secretary to the Pan-African Congress.
Sure. Which
involved the greatest personalities in the Pan-African movement, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, Marconi, all of them were there. And many of the persons who eventually became leaders in Africa also participated in this huge conference and so on. And then from then on, his contribution to accelerating the independence movement throughout Africa, how he personally selected Patrice Lumumba, trained him, and gave him the logistics he needed in order to gain independence in the Congo. And Patrice Lumumba himself, as a student of Nkrumah, has become a huge icon in global history and so on. His attempt to unite Africa, the fact that by February 24, 1966, he had built a confederation of Mali, Ghana, Guinea. Mali, Ghana, Guinea had virtually become one country. There is evidence which suggests very clearly that the Congo had signed on to that confederation and that the nucleus of a United States of Africa had been built by 4 countries, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and the Congo. Then you look at the development options he presented. And today you look at the problems that face the Ghanaian people. And you cannot resist, saying that, look, if Nkrumah's blueprint had been followed, perhaps many of the problems that confront us today would not be there. And I'm talking about problems with power supply. I'm talking about problems with unemployment, with agricultural production, with industrialization, all of it. If you look at his blueprint, which was encapsulated in the 7-year development plan, there were answers to all of our problems. Unfortunately, after 1966, or on February 24, 1966, he was overthrown by an alliance of Western intelligence forces led by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. And many, many things happened. Many things happened which defy logic, One of the things that I remember happened was that Ghana's parliament sat under a certificate of urgency.
Sure.
And this is interesting. The whole parliament sat under a certificate of urgency to pass a law which made it a criminal offense to hold Nkrumah's photograph, possess Nkrumah's photograph, to print Nkrumah's photographs, and to distribute Nkrumah's photograph. This is the level of absurdity that we are subjected to as a people. You could not hold Nkrumah's photograph, you go to prison. You could not circulate Nkrumah's photograph, you go to prison. You understand? Absurd. This is the height of absurdity and so on. But then, we also know of the story where Nkrumah's books, everything that showed his ideas, everything that portrayed his ideas, were actually burnt in bonfires. Burnt not by illiterates, not by persons who did not appreciate the value of scholarship and so on, but actually burnt on university campuses under the supervision of professors and so on. Incredible.
Is that then to suggest that at a certain point, there were some sections of society here in Ghana who had indoctrinated the young people to see Nkrumah as the enemy rather than the ally, And also, probably, that the people themselves thought, okay, we've had enough of Nkrumah, let's try something else.
Yeah, I think that's a wrong way of looking at it. You know, I mean, what happened on February 24, 1966 and thereafter, something which had been deliberately orchestrated by the enemies of African liberation, by those who wanted to continue to hold us in subjugation, by those who did not want us to develop. So they had orchestrated all of this. It had nothing to do with the people of Ghana.
But I'm focusing more on indoctrination. That's what I'm talking about. That all these persons or all these influences.
It didn't happen. I mean, what happened was the use of brute force. I was in middle school
at the time
when the coup occurred on February 24, 1966. And my own experiences tell me that all of this was orchestration and it was forced. You know, we lived in Kotobabi in Accra. And that morning, we walked to what is today the Accra New Town Post Office, that area and so on. And some of Nkrumah's security men, you know, stayed there. And I saw how soldiers in armored vehicles stormed them, beat them up. There was blood all over the place and so on. I saw it with my own eyes, you know. I saw the raid on Abavana Junction, and similar things happened. And then I saw the raid on the Kanda Flats, you know, where persons who belong to the CPP stayed and so on. I saw armored vehicles point their nozzle into story buildings and fire, and refrigerators falling all over and so on, you know. So the population was intimidated. My own father was a trade union leader. He had a lot of books on Nkrumah, on socialism and so on. They had to hide them, you understand? Not because they didn't believe in it, but because it was dangerous to be associated with Nkrumah, you understand? So people came out, some say to jubilate and so on. They did it out of fear. They did it for their survival, you know, and I experienced it. This is not a story that I read from books and so on. I mean, and the fact that it didn't take long for the Nkrumahist movement to revive itself and to play a key role in national politics, it's testimony, you know, to the fact that it's not the people who rebelled against Nkrumah. And there's a lot of historical evidence. For example, on September 21, 1961, the then British High Commissioner in Ghana, whose name is A.W. Snelling, sent a cable to his government. And in that cable, he urged his government to do everything possible to get rid of Nkrumah because Nkrumah was making the African too politically conscious. That was the reason. It was not about they succeeding in indoctrinating our people and so on. They feared Nkrumah. They feared what Nkrumah stood for. They knew that it would lead to resetting the world. And if it led to a reset of the world, the African people, and indeed peoples all over the world, would take their destiny into their own hands, own their own resources, and exploit these resources for their own benefit. They feared that.
There are a lot of fore conversations on Nkrumah, his legacy and his ideas, his story. And there are those who also oppose. Like I mentioned earlier, I mean, the same set of people with whom he started, the UGCC, then had to also look in another direction. And it has stayed like that to date, to the extent that those who have followed in that political tradition have even gone to argue why or whether or not he is the founder of Ghana and all of that. But the element of getting settled as a leader, becoming comfortable in the space, driving a vision, and then being seen as one of a dictator, sort of. What's your reaction every time you hear this word, dictator, that Nkrumah had become obsessed with leading Ghana, broadening it into Africa and all of that, and wanting to sink his claws of leadership into us for the rest of his life?
Well, first of all, let's clarify the breakaway. The breakup of the UGCC. It's important to note that Nkrumah did not initiate the breakaway.
Very well, yeah.
You understand? It's important to note that Nkrumah's breakaway actually started with the discomfort of the UGCC leadership with its methods of agitation. Nkrumah had joined the UGCC, had turned it into a mass party in a matter of 18 months, so with branches all over the country. His preferred option was agitation, not letters.
Which is what's eventually led to his incarceration.
Exactly, not love letters to the colonial government and so on. He wanted to mobilize the people, to agitate, to organize strikes, to organize boycotts and so on. And the UGC leadership was very uncomfortable with this. And indeed, after the 1948 riots, for which the UGCC was blamed and so on, the leadership thought that Nkrumah was upsetting the situation, So they came up with a plot, actually, to remove him as General Secretary of the movement, and then eventually they offered him the position of Treasurer and so on. Now, by that time, the UGCC was Nkrumah. I mean, no doubt at all, the UGCC was Nkrumah. The fact that when he left the UGCC became an empty shell, and he beat the UGCC in an election. I mean, walloped the UGCC. The worst electoral defeat in our history occurred in 1951. So Nkrumah was the UGCC. So the attempt to sideline him, the attempt to remove him as General Secretary and so on, compelled his followers to agitate for a breakout. And the historical record shows that his letter of resignation was written on the back of a guy called Nkrumah. You understand?
Nkrumah. Yeah.
And that he himself was uncomfortable about leaving the UGCC. In fact, one historical account is that he cried. He shed tears, but the pressure on him was so great that eventually he signed his letter of resignation and formed the Convention People's Party, you understand, which won elections, landslide elections in 1951. Okay. Now, this claim about Nkrumah being a dictator, where does it come from? Again, the historical record is clear. No decision was taken without reference to Parliament. Every decision that was taken was endorsed by Parliament. It went through the process. The people's representative endorsed every decision that was made. Now, reference has been made to the Preventive
Detention Act. Yes, I was going to come to that. Yes.
Show me one country in the world. Show me one government in Ghana which does not have a Preventive Detention Act.
Maybe coined in another, with another, description.
In essence,
yes.
There's no country in the world today, no government in Ghana has lived without the Preventive Detention Act, called something else. I mean, when Nkrumah was overthrown and the National Liberation Council, so-called National Liberation Council, took over, they claimed to have, jettisoned the Preventive Detention Act. But quickly in its place, they passed the Protective Custody Law. If you read the Protective Custody Law and the Preventive Detention Act, there's no difference. Absolutely no difference. Just a change of title, no difference. And indeed, under the Protective Custody Law, many of the activists of the Convention People's Party, people who sympathize with Nkrumah and so on, went to jail without trial or charge. Without charge or trial. You understand? One of them actually was a woman, very prominent, one of our very first female parliamentarians. And I'm told she actually had to give birth in prison. Look, these people who talk about human rights and so on, look at their record. Boy Moses, one of Nkrumah's associates, was arrested. You know what they did to him?
Tell me.
They didn't charge him. They didn't try him. They constructed a cage, put him in the cage, tied the cage to a truck, and drove him through the principal streets of Accra. I mean, how can people who acted this way be talking about dictatorship and human rights and so on? They put a human being in a cage and drove him along the streets of Accra. they have no locus. We're talking about human rights and dictatorship and so on. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. There's no basis for that. No basis. Today, in the United States of America, they have what they call the Patriot Act. Today, as we sit here, which allows detention of what they call terrorists and so on, without charge or trial. It is the same as the so-called Preventive Detention Act under the Nkrumah regime. Britain has it. Germany has it. You know the story of the Guantanamo Bay.
Of course.
You know, and what happened, the Abu Ghraib prison, and so on. What's the difference? Now, interestingly, those who accuse Nkrumah of dictatorship and violation of rights and so on see the United States of America as their model. Something must be wrong, you understand? Now, those people who saw Nkrumah as a dictator and so on, who was their biggest mentor in the West African sub-region? Houphouët-Boigny of La Côte d'Ivoire. Houphouët-Boigny of La Côte d'Ivoire was running a one-party state. Houphouët-Boigny was the running a one-party state in La Côte d'Ivoire, was actually a French citizen and a member of the French Parliament. They saw nothing wrong with that. And they continue to support that contraption, you know, that contraption which Houphouët-Boigny created in La Côte d'Ivoire. They continue to support it up to today. So they should not waste our years, you know, with those stories about dictatorship and violation of human rights and so on. What is their own record?
But that then also, you know, brings up this, you know, seeming justification, if we may put it that way, because someone did it wrong, you're also doing it wrong. Don't even talk about it because, you know, you're doing same.
Well, I'm not talking about doing things wrong under the Nkrumah regime. Oh. I mean, look, there's one case that I like to mention. I mean, the bombing of the Accra Sports Stadium. These were school children who had gathered in the Accra Sports Stadium. School children, innocent school children. Opponents of Nkrumah actually went to the Accra Sports Stadium and dropped bombs, killed the children. One of them survived until recently. She's called Asantua. She used to live in Dansuma. And she lived with this pain, amputated leg and so on, all her life. What are you going to do with people like that? You understand? Oh. The Accra Sports Stadium bombing alone. These were terrorists by any definition. Now, something is very important. One of those responsible for the bombing and so on, I think it was Obeche Bilamte, was actually tried in the High Court. The judges were very interesting. There was Justice Van Leer, Justice Akufo-Addo, Justice Van Leer, Justice Akufo-Addo, and one more judge, I think Justice Kosa. They tried Obeche Bilamte. They found him guilty of terrorism. You know who Justice Akufo-Addo is?
Of course.
The father of our most recent president and a doyen of the UP tradition. He believed that the bomb throwers, as they called them in those days, were terrorists. Nothing more or less than terrorists. And actually convicted Obeche Bilamte. Obeche Bilamte was not convicted by Nkrumah. He was not convicted by a CPP judge. He was convicted by Akufo-Addo, Akukosa, and Justice Van Leer. They convicted Obeche Bilamte for terrorism. You understand? So the story is clear. Any recourse to our history, any study of our history, reveals the true identity and motivation of the opposition to Nkrumah and makes Nkrumah stand very tall. There's one more fact that nobody speaks about. Nkrumah was in power for 9 years, 9 long years. In this 9-year period, none of his opponents was executed. None of his opponents was executed. Okay? There was one execution, and that was the execution of Sergeant Ametewe.
Ametewe, yes.
Sergeant Ametewe, who tried to kill Nkrumah in the Flagstaff
House. Of course. Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that Ametewe was sentenced by a competent court to death.
In fact, that particular case is a prominent part of case law in criminal law in our law schools. Yeah.
But Ametewe was sentenced to death. So for 9 years, there was only one execution. 9 years. I mean, compare that to other countries.
Yeah.
Including the United States of America.
Yeah.
You understand? I mean, that's a huge statement about the credentials of Nkrumah. You know, one execution. I had the privilege of interviewing Mr. A.K. Deku, who took part in organizing the 1966 coup and became a commissioner under the National Liberation Council just before he died. And Mr. A.K. Deku, who took part in organizing the coup, said in the interview is available, you know, many people have seen the interview, that Nkrumah is the best leader that Africa ever had. I then asked him, why then did he take part in organizing his overthrow? And his answer simply was that if he refused to go along, he would have been killed. So even some of those who organized the coup against Nkrumah,
they did it reluctantly.
Reluctantly, that they were coerced. You know, that they did it at the peril of their lives and so on. So it's clear. I mean, the evidence is so overwhelming.
You know, so Nkrumah succeeded in starting his own political tradition, the CPP. He also tried to bring the whole of Africa together in what could have been the United States of Africa, as we all refer to it. The CPP is not exactly a vibrant political force as we speak. When the year 2025, the CPP has suffered recruitment, if I may use a better term, of some of its most prominent figures and faces into other traditions. Now we talk about the MPP and the NDC, and there's quite a good number. I mean, in immediate history, you talk about, you know, the Dr. Kwabena Dufors and, you know, Freddie Blaze and all of that, who are all from the CPP tradition. What has happened over the period?
Well, fact is that Nkrumah is much, much bigger than the CPP of today. And Nkrumah's influence transcends the CPP of today. I mean, there are many people who are in the National Democratic Congress, and if we were to ask them, they describe themselves as Nkrumahists. There are even people in the New Patriotic Party who describe themselves as Nkrumahists. And there are many people outside the former political arrangement who describe themselves as Nkrumahists. Now, if all of these forces were to come together, I have no doubt that they will become the most formidable political force in our country today.
That's a very big fact, but before you go on, why then are these Nkrumahists unable to stay loyal to the vision and stay within an establishment like the CPP, which is the biggest, embodiment and testament of his political ideas?
I'm not so sure that the CPP is the biggest embodiment and testament of Nkrumah.
Could be, for want of a better.
But now, given his performance in elections, given the strength of the fervent of Nkrumah and so on, I don't think we can make that statement. Okay. But be that as it may, I think it's important to go back to the history of the Convention People's Party itself. The Convention People's Party was, in essence, a nationalist party engaged in a struggle for national liberation. So it brought together all kinds of forces. There were right-wing elements in the Convention People's Party. There were people in the Convention People's Party who did not share Nkrumah's idea. So it was some kind of a broad front for national liberation. Everybody, it was a broad church. So now, after independence, Nkrumah tried to convert the Convention People's Party into a socialist movement. He tried. That's why he set up the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute as part of the preparation and so on. The 1966 coup truncated that effort. Okay. So within the CPP itself, broad CPP, historical CPP, there's no ideological cohesion. There's no ideological cohesion. Okay. And then again, the other factor which I think is important is that Nkrumah was such a huge figure that it became almost impossible to replace him. Okay? His views, his ideas, his ideals, his organizational practices and so on, is what brought people together. So without him, the center began to crack. Oh. But that's one part of it. The other part is the deliberate effort to dismember the Convention People's Party, to destroy the Convention People's Party. First of all, the party was banned after the 1966 and could not be revived until about 1991-92, where efforts began to revive it, where people began to congregate under the Kwame Nkrumah Welfare Society and so on. It was banned. It had been banned. You couldn't organize the CPP. It was legally impossible to organize the CPP. We should not forget that. Okay.
So then it means that the downward spiral of that influence and all of that of the CPP started as far back as that time when all these events happened?
I believe that the Nkrumahist tradition, is rising again and rising very fast. I see it as a potent force. I see it as the ideological guidance, for our future and so on. So I don't believe that, it's taking a fall. I don't believe that at all. And we will be proved right.
Could that be?
Because I travel around this country.
Sure.
I interact with people in the trade unions, in the youth movement, in the student movement, and so on. And there is overwhelming support for Nkrumah's ideas. There's a yearning for a re-emergence of an Nkrumahist movement, and so on. So I have a lot of hope.
Is that also to say
that... And then also, boss, look at our election results.
Yes.
Look at our election results. The first
You mean the recent election?
All of our election results.
All right.
The first time in our history that a Dankwa Buzia contraption managed to win elections without stopping the CPP from participating in the elections and so on was when? 2000. President Kufuor. The first truly democratically elected Dankwa Buzia president in competition, in a fair competition, was President Kufuor. How did President Kufuor win elections? If you remember.
Eventually it was...
if you remember.
Yeah.
President Kufuor, for his campaign, actually erected billboards which showed him sitting with Nkrumah. If you remember. He formed an alliance with the Convention People's Party and so on. The party was strong, you understand? And it helped Kufuor to become president. I worked on the Kufuor campaign, in spite of the fact that I'm not an adherent to the Dankwa Buzia tradition and so on. I worked actively on the Kufuor campaign, okay? So that was the first time. Now, the second time was when Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo was elected president. Check his history. Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo was a card-bearing member of the Convention People's Party. Indeed, he belonged to the most radical wing of the Convention People's Party. He was, or claimed to be, a Marxist and so on. So in that election, there were many elements in the CPP and so on who said, well, but that is our man. So when they started denying Nkrumah, rewriting our history and so on, what happened? They lost the elections. They lost the elections in a very massive way. I mean, this is the second most humiliating election result that Dankwa Buzia tradition has suffered. First being 1951. That tells a huge story.
Great.
That's a huge story about the influence of Nkrumah, even today, in politics, in national politics. You understand? It is difficult to win elections if you are antagonistic to the Nkrumah tradition and so on. You remember that in the last campaign for the 2024 elections, when the running mate of Dr. Bawumia started making statements apparently denigrating Nkrumah and so on, what was the warning? Those who knew the tradition, those who understood the politics of Ghana, said that there's a clear signal that we're going to lose the elections. You remember?
And they did.
And they did.
Yeah.
You understand? So I don't believe that the Nkrumah tradition, the Nkrumah vision, and so on, has suffered any significant reversal. It has not been mobilized sufficiently, yet. The framework for mobilizing it, for pushing it forward, is weak. But it will change.
Well,
and it will change very, very soon.
Very soon. Well,
very soon. I'm optimistic.
We look forward to that time.
Yeah.
Now, to this, this piece that, you've put together, and how it all relates to Nkrumahism and what we're seeing today regarding how much worth we're placing on the Nkrumah legacy. We find ourselves on a part of Mother Earth which is blessed with majority of the world's natural resources, yet there's the resource curse. And the problems that we see in most of the countries that are resource rich are similar. Now, Kwame Nkrumah wanted us to have a certain shift. We've gone in the opposite direction, where the West and others who now have the economic power are controlling the way we're even exploring and exploiting these resources. Where do we go from here? You see, for instance, a Burkina Faso, who many years after experiencing the leadership of a Thomas Sankara are trying to, go back to the ideals and try to tow a certain direction where they could produce themselves, they could produce for themselves, feed the economy, and even give some more to export and grow an even bigger economy. Where do we go from here as the situation stands now?
Well, I think that reparation is a movement to reset the world. And we need to reset the world. I mean, if you don't reset this world, you're not going anywhere. We'll continue to suffer humiliation, we'll continue to suffer deprivation, and so on. So reparation is a call to reset, the world. And to that extent, it is not in conflict with Nkrumah's ideas. It is not in conflict with the Pan-Africanist vision, and so on. And to a very large extent, it's not even in conflict with the principles of socialism. What I've tried to do is to bring together all of these elements, Marxist analysis, the Pan-Africanist vision, and so on, to bring it all together, in one book. But perhaps I'm overstating what I tried to do, I didn't set out to write a book.
I see.
I didn't set out to write a book. I was persuaded by a friend to write an essay on reparation after a conversation.
I see.
So I started writing an essay on reparation.
So at which point did you decide, look, we have to expand it beyond?
That's the point I'm making. Now, when I started this essay, I found that I couldn't stop. I'm working on a book, a bigger book, much bigger book, and so on. It's more like an autobiography and so on. I've done about 200 pages of that already. But when I started writing this essay, I couldn't work on that book anymore. I got consumed by the passion to finish this essay. And then I set out to write a 50-page essay. And then by the time I realized, after about 3 weeks of writing and so on, I found that I had 70 pages. And there was still more to tell. And then I had 100 pages, and then I had 150 pages of work. And then I said, but this is a book. It's no longer an essay. So that's how this book came about. And my brother, this book has made such an impact that I can't believe. Okay. It's all not because of my own thoughts and the facts that I put together and so on. So many factors has contributed to that. First of all is the fact that the foreword to the book was written by President John Dramani Mahama under some very strange circumstances. I mean, I knew he was president. I knew presidents have very little time to read manuscripts and so on, you know. So even when I was asking him to write the foreword, I wasn't sure that he was going to accept. But then he readily accepted. I called him up, and he doesn't always pick my calls. He picks my calls once in a long while, but I keep trying. But on this day, he picked the call, and I said, well, I've done a book on reparations. Would you please kindly, write the foreword? And his answer was, bring the script. That's all he said. So we sent the script, and I was wondering how a sitting president could have time to read.
As busy as he is.
Yeah. 150 pages and have time to write a foreword and so on. 2 weeks later, I get a call from Dr. Callistus Mahama, and he says the foreword is ready. And when I read the foreword, I was shocked. I mean, you have it, read it.
Sure.
The scholarship, the historical breadth, the analysis just blew me out of this world. I mean, I was so very impressed with President John Dramani Mahama, his depth of knowledge, his analysis. He wrote 3-4 pages, of a foreword, and it's classic. But you know that President John Mahama is also the African Union champion on reparations.
Oh,
he's the point person of the African Union for reparations.
Very.
And that itself also adds some weight, to the book. And then the pre-launch was in Malabo. The pre-launch was in Malabo at the conference of ECOSOL. I went there to introduce the book. And immediately the requests started pouring in. And then I stayed on for the foreign ministers meeting of the AU. And Honorable Samuel Okudatu Ablakwa came, and the first thing he did was to ask for copies of the book. And by the time I could realize, all the foreign ministers were asking for copies of the book and so on. 2 days later, President John Dramani Mahama arrives in Malabo for the Heads of State Media Review, summit. And he's asking for copies of the book. I didn't have enough, but whatever I had, I passed it on. So President John Dramani Mahama himself, personally, distributed the book to fellow heads of states. And he told the story only last week about how they asked for autograph. He didn't know how to get me, so he autographed the book.
The book himself.
Yeah, he told the story himself, So that pushed the book into a certain level and so on. And within 2 weeks after the Malabo conference, we had 30,000 requests for the book. I couldn't believe it. I mean, this is not what I intended. It's writing a simple essay, and so on. And this is what has happened, 30,000 requests for the book,
Interesting.
We are struggling. We are really struggling to make it available to everybody.
Yeah. Just before we wrap up this conversation, we do know that time is never enough to get into the subject of reparations and how Africa can strategically go towards the direction of ensuring that the West, and you see it in little drops. For instance, so 2432, less than 2 years ago, made a request to the United Kingdom to return some stolen artifacts. We've seen the French president, make a statement about returning a certain, valuing what went into the valuing, we don't know, but valuing and deciding to give what I see as a paltry $5 billion to certain countries, that they colonized and all of that. What else do we need?
Well, first of all, I insist that those who enslaved us and colonized us should stop insulting us. We are not asking for money. No amount of money can pay for the humiliation the dehumanizing experiences that we suffered, and from the theft of our resources. No amount of money can pay for that. So reparation is not about the payment of compensation. It may be a small aspect of reparation, but it is not what is reparation. Reparation essentially is about, as I said from the beginning, resetting the world and the redistribution of surplus value. Okay? There's no institution, banks, whatever, in the capitalist world today, including their religious institutions, which does not own its wealth to the theft of African resources. All of them owe their wealth to the theft of African resources, and I can continue. Look, the Queen of
England, of course, before you go on, the burial of the Queen of England, I mean, the crown that had so much commentary around it had, diamonds that were mined and, taken from here.
That's one aspect.
Yeah.
But the gold carriage in which the Queen of England rides and in which the King of England today rides, that gold was stolen from Cape Coast. That whole gold carriage, the gold came from Cape Coast. You understand? Now, if that gold came back to Cape Coast today, can you imagine what it would do to the lives of people in Cape Coast, in the central region, in Ghana, and so on? Just that gold. You understand? Our forebears, the best of our forebears, our engineers, our doctors, the strongest, the young, and so on. Some estimates say that 1.6 million of them were captured as beasts of burden and sent to the Americas and the Caribbean and so on to work as beasts of burden for hundreds of years without pay. Some estimates say that 80 million of our people were taken out into slavery and so on. Just imagine one continent losing 80 million people. Now let me talk just briefly about the reset agenda. You see the United Nations. Africa is a continent of 1.4 billion people.
Correct.
We have no say, no significant say in the affairs of the United Nations. Forget the fact that Kofi Annan became Secretary General and so on. Decisions are made in the Security Council. We are
Top
not
five,
there.
we're not, of course.
We are not. We are not
there, nowhere near.
We don't have a veto power.
Yeah.
So affairs in the United Nations are determined by 5 countries. 1.4 billion Africans are excluded from making decisions. We need to change the United Nations. We need to reset the United Nations. We need to make sure that Africa has a voice on the Security Council. You take institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and so on. They are not there for our interest. Indeed, at the time that these institutions were established, Africa had no say in the United Nations. The United Nations for a long time had not more than 50 members. Why? Because we were colonies and did not have the sovereignty which enabled us to become members of the United Nations. So when they were setting up the IMF, when they were setting up the World Bank, when they were setting up the World Trade Organization and so on, our interests did not factor. Reparations mean that we need to reset the world. We need to have a say in the World Trade Organization. We need to have a strong say in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
Interesting.
I mean,
amazing. Yeah.
We are bigger than the United States of America. Why does the United States of America have a veto and Africa doesn't have a veto? All that has to change. So this is a new struggle. This is a new phase of the liberation struggle. And we will win. We need to unite the peoples of Africa and the Caribbean. We need to unite the working class, even in the capitalist states, and the working class everywhere in the world for this huge battle for the new liberation. And my brother, I can assure you that we will win. Those of us who are a little older, those of us who are in the departure lounge,
not yet.
May not see the promised land, but we will certainly reach the promised land.
Very well.
We will build a new world,
very well.
An entirely new world.
Very well.
A new world in which no child will go to bed on an empty stomach. A new world without nuclear weapons. A new peaceful world where disease will be fought and conquered, and we will succeed.
Well, the word amen means let everything that has been said come true. A high point on which to wrap up this conversation, which obviously we would have to have a second part on. I've been sharing the great company of the legendary Kwesi Pratt Jnr., an author, a Pan-Africanist, and of course a media owner, the founder of the Pan-African Television Network, bringing us a lot of perspective to the Nkrumah conversation, the commemoration of this particular day, and what it also means based on the foundation that Nkrumah set for the future that we all very much desire from the perspective of Africanism and from Africans. Thank you so much. It's been lovely having you, and would have to come and join the printers to quickly, get as many versions as possible so we could distribute to the rest of the world. And of course, if you have a chance, look, grab this because it's a great piece and has a lot in terms of perspective and where we should be directed. Away from that as well, just before we go, where do we get copies of this?
Well, actually, it's available on Amazon.
Amazon, very well.
Available on Amazon. But here, it's available at the front desk of Pan-African Television and also at the Freedom Center not far from here.
Very well.
And then the Freedom Bookshop.
Great.
On the Laimomo Street, near what used to be Apollo Theatre.
Apollo Theatre, yes, in Asylum Down. And that's also a very big history lesson as well. For those of you who do not know, it's called Laimomo Street. Respectfully, I would ask that you autograph this copy for me. This is the the privilege I get that you may be struggling to get. Well,